Hello and welcome to Game and Read. My name is Peter.
And I'm Erin.
And we are here to do this week's episode where we are discussing The Twins from Hell.
Our book is From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. And our game is Assassin's Creed Syndicate, specifically the Jack the Ripper DLC.
I think it's both. We're doing both.
Okay, we're doing both.
There's going to be some emphasis on the DLC portion, but if you've only played the main game or portion of that, I think you will still get a good amount out of this. That being said, this is our primary discussion where we're going to talk about each one of these pieces individually. So we're going to do our first section on From Hell, and then our second section will be on just Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And then next week we will be doing our pairing discussion where we've put them all together.
Before we start any of our discussions, both of these things do handle Jack the Ripper, who murdered sex workers in London. And so there is just a content warning in both of these things for violence against women, for graphic violence, a lot of sex, just so that you're aware of what we're going to be talking about. We won't get too graphic in our descriptions, but the nature of this discussion, there will involve some talk of violence.
Yes. If you're looking for an introduction on what we're talking about, that was on our episode last week. You can go ahead and check that out. But our goal for this is to be able to freely discuss everything in here respectfully, while also just being able to talk about what happens in it. So that's just a general notice to everybody.
Let's get started.
If I may say, Aaron, I'm pretty sure the story from Hell is very it's basic. It's so straightforward. There's nothing strange going on. There's no ambiguities between mental illness and the occult and supernatural or royal conspiracies at all.
Oh, really? Can you give me 3 sentences about what this is about if it's so simple?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's, this upstanding surgeon to the Queen Victoria. He decides that, the best plan of action to deal with a illegitimate child scandal of the royal family is to go around and murder 5 women in incredibly brutal fashion. And that's it. That's the entire story. That's all of it right there.
Lies.
Nothing more to say on it.
Lies.
But that everything I have said is accurate, at least from the story. Not my judgment calls on it, but yes, this From Hell is about William Gull, who was an actual surgeon. This is all historical figures, pretty heavily researched by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell to make this it's a fictionalization. They know that. And they have large appendices in which they are actually breaking down the factual elements, the historic elements, and the different decisions they made in the book. But Sir William Gull was the actual royal physician to Queen Victoria and several members of the royal family. He got that post after helping save one of the princes about a decade prior to the Whitechapel Jack the Ripper murders. And in this particular fictionalization, he is tasked by Queen Victoria to silence this group of sex workers who know that Prince Eddie, who is actually Prince Albert, had an illegitimate child with a common, woman of the lower classes.
Right. This woman, Annie, was a shop girl. She had no idea that her husband and baby daddy was royal until she got taken away to the madhouse on Queen Victoria's orders.
Yeah. Literally just kind of kidnapped out of nowhere. And she's like, what's going on? Because she didn't know her husband was actually a prince. And the reason he married her is that he thought that might offer her some protection. At the beginning of this book, they really kind of set up in that he is a very naive and foppish young lad who's taken out into the real world of London by his buddy, the artist Syndicate, and just kind of falls in love with like the first pretty girl he sees, and then has to have sex with her, and father a kid because it's, the 1880s, so it's hard not to, I guess, randomly get pregnant.
Once Queen Victoria realizes that these sex workers are trying to blackmail. So basically, this group of women they've learned that there's this scandal, this illegitimate baby. They're trying to blackmail Syndicate, actually, because they need to pay a debt to one of Whitechapel's gangs that is threatening them. And so they're like, we know how to get this money. We will blackmail information. Like, oh, you don't want your buddy to be, smeared in the papers.
Yeah.
Sadly, joke's on them because Gull decides, again, like you so eloquently put it, that the best way to deal with this is to just murder them.
Well, here's my question with this, though, and they don't entirely set it up one way or the other. So he's a proper surgeon. He does actual doctoring. He is held in high esteem legitimately for his medical practices. Why would Queen Victoria go to him? And I guess this is kind of like the interesting logical jump to be like, well, why would she go to him to become her hitman? It's clear why she would maybe use him to get Annie shoved into like a hospital and declared crazy, but why would she then be like, I need you to take these people out? That's not generally something you go to your doctor for. And so I am a little curious, and I can't really seem to fathom why that would be the jump there.
Well, so Gull makes Annie crazy, quote unquote crazy, by fucking with her thyroid gland, which I don't know what that does, but clearly it must do something because that's part of your body. And so I think the idea, my read of this is that Queen Victoria is like, okay, Gull is reliable. Mm-hmm. He's in royal service to us. We can trust him.
And he's a Freemason.
And, which we'll have to get into that.
Yeah, so he's got 2 layers of yes, he is their trusted surgeon, and he's part of this secret society that is also very much tied to the crown in this particular story.
Right. So my interpretation is that Queen Victoria doesn't specifically say to murder the sex workers. She might imply it, but she does say to silence them. So in my mind, I was like, oh, she was trying to basically be like, go do whatever you did to Annie, to these other sex workers. Go make them, commit them, make them insane, whatever. Okay. Get them out of threat. So my thought is that she didn't suggest murder, but then she didn't condemn it once it started happening and the police were in on it and all this stuff. But her initial thought was, I have this I have this surgeon. I can trust him. He'll do whatever he needs to do to make sure these women don't talk.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't,
and he just went off the rails. Well, with his, his particular brand of murder. Exactly,
because I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but there's this occult layer to the murder.
Do you want to start with the occult stuff now that we've breached that subject? Because we've also touched on the power, which I know we want to talk about. Which one do you want to start with?
Oh, God. Let's start with occult.
Okay.
I can't resist.
So why does he want to murder them in this fashion, and why is he so gung-ho about this particular task? Because as soon as she's like, I need you to do it, he's like, I already know how I want to. No problem.
Okay. So stay with me here. Gull is a Freemason.
Yes.
Okay. Gull thinks that the Freemasons are that a part of their job is to continue the male dominance over women in all aspects. Okay?
Yes.
So Gull thinks that this blackmail conspiracy is an Illuminati threat to Freemasonry and civilization as a male situation.
Right. I don't even know if he sees it. I know he does mention the Illuminati a couple times, which are kind of like the Bavarian version of the Freemasons. But it seems like he is almost more of a spiritual. He feels more of a spiritual threat rather than a literal one. He doesn't think the Illuminati are necessarily the people who like put these sex workers up to it, but it's more like, oh man, this is a spiritual threat. There's a specter hanging over what we do, and I need to kind of realign things by doing this, effectively a blood ritual.
Right. So he spends like an entire chapter issue. I don't know how we break
it's
them
like
down.
one full like comic book length going on this tour of London.
Yeah, so this guy, Netley.
Oh, Netley.
He's the carriage driver. I don't know what he is. He drives the horses.
He's an accomplice to Gull in that he is the one who drives him around in a carriage. I think he's officially in the employ of the royal family, and he was kind of assigned to like, oh, go help out Gull with whatever he's doing. And then he also ends up helping Gull in. Gull straight up tells him like, oh, we're gonna go murder these ladies. And Netley's like, okay, sir.
Until the end, and he's like, no more, please, no more.
Right, but Netley also like helps him track him down. He helps get them into the carriage for the murders to take place. He helps mark them where he like gives them a fancy new hat and be like, it's the one with the blue hat over there. Go kill her.
Netley is the worst.
Oh yeah.
But so there's this chapter where Gull directs Netley to all these different places in London on the specific path that turns out, if you look at it on a map, it's a pentagram, and there are 5 points, and Gull is gonna murder these women in these different spots as his blood sacrifice to ensure male dominance over women. Like, that is what he wants. He's like, and that was one thing that this experience of reading this was not fun. Like, it wasn't a fun thing to consume, but it is very clear that, I mean, Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, and visually and in the words, do an unfortunately phenomenal job at capturing the hatred of women in this story.
Yes, but before we get onto that, we need to get back to any other bits from the occult stuff, because this is it's effectively like 1/12 of the book is just this tour around London of being like, oh, here's the obelisk that we stole from Egypt, and it represents Ra, the sun god, who's actually part of this god, who's part of this god, kind of going into the theology of the Freemasons, where they worship a kind of, it's almost like a Unitarian version of God, in that it's like all these different gods are kind of the same God.
Yeah,
but like an evil version of Unitarianism.
So, right. So they call their Freemason Masonic god Jabulon, Jahbulon.
It's like part Jehovah, part Baal, part...
Right.
It's just kind of an amalgam of these different deities from different large civilizations and historic civilizations, that they kind of are like, oh, we know the secret. It's actually this. And I think his devotion to the magic of masonry is interesting, in that he also, Gull actively is like, oh, Freemasonry's not that old. I know it's only like from 150 years ago, but I actually think it does have, like, he both knows Freemasonry is like a little bit of a sham, but he's also really into it and is like, no, they got onto the right thing. They're just not as magical and ancient as they want you to believe.
He certainly utilizes Freemasonry as a vehicle for whatever his more occult, mystical beliefs are. So he acknowledges, right, that Freemasonry isn't that old and isn't that mystical and isn't that magical, but it's the best vehicle, the best place for him to achieve his goals.
Right. And I think it also, there's another intersection here between the occult nature of it and some of the points they make about mental illness, specifically of this time. So, was it Gull, prior to all of this happening, has, so we see a little bit of his life. He's clearly a fairly kind of morbid person, also very fine with gore and violence, goes through becoming a surgeon in the 19th century, which was a pretty, I'm going to say, a little gross thing to get into. So he has, a fine stomach about doing all that kind of stuff, and is very cold and pragmatic in that way. But he's in his 60s, and he has a stroke while on vacation. He kind of miraculously lives, considering having a stroke at that time, at that age, and where he was. But they seem to kind of indicate that may have been what set him kind of down this road.
Yeah. So this is based on a theory of Jack the Ripper, right? Like and Gull was a real historical figure. Obviously, Queen Victoria. This scandal really happened. All this stuff. But Alan Moore has said that he fictionalized the stroke as this theophany, which is the revelation. So
Gotcha.
William Gull, as a real historical figure, did have a stroke on vacation, but Alan Moore fictionalizes that to be this jumping off point.
Right, where he sees his version of God.
Exactly.
And believes that, his time has finally come for his big, masterful action in his life.
Exactly. So in the end of the book, you go with Gull. Gull is
he's kind of unstuck in time.
Yeah, he is in this prison cell, which, okay, I won't. There are people having sex in his cell with him, which was so deeply disturbing, even though Gull is like a horrible human being in this story.
Yeah.
There is still something so gross and demeaning and dehumanizing about that experience.
They 100% are like the concept of asylums and hospitals in the 19th century are a bad thing in the book From Hell.
Correct. But my point is, at the end of the book, you have Gull, and it's right before he dies. He's going to die. But he sort of goes on this flight through time and space, and but also go into current day and see people that he actually knows or that are actually involved.
So because this book can't just be about a theory of Jack the Ripper, they have to add in some, I guess it would be kind of a metaphysical argument about whether or not time is a linear line or everything is happening simultaneously and you're only experiencing certain parts. In this book, Gull effectively ends up experiencing time as everything happening simultaneously. So there will be effectively flashbacks, flash forwards, and his own kind of specter will kind of pop up in different things where he ends up being the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and some famous paintings of monsters, and he sees London in the 90s, presumably, where he's just in an office and he's like, what is going on here? You've become so bored with what I would consider miracles. And he just kind of has this weird moment in really the last third of the book, because he has that flash forward into the 90s after he kills his final victim, Marie Kelly.
Well, he doesn't kill Marie Kelly.
No, he does kill Marie Kelly. No, I'm saying when he actually kills Marie Kelly.
Okay.
What do you mean he doesn't kill Marie Kelly?
So I know this because I was reading an article. He might kill Marie Kelly. It is unclear in the book because Alan Moore, there's that woman at the very end while he is on his Gull is it flight through space and time?
Yeah.
That woman who has children who are named for the victims in Whitechapel.
Yeah.
Some people say that could be Marie Kelly, and that the woman that was actually killed in Marie Kelly's apartment was one of the women she was sleeping with.
Oh, wow. I didn't even really piece that together. I actually had seen that as that was possibly Marie's childhood, but I guess that also makes sense on that end.
I also thought it was Marie's childhood because she's mentioned she's Irish. We know from just her
and then
comments.
You're on this beautiful hillside in Ireland.
And there's children named after the victim. Oh, maybe this is, I don't know. But I don't know why I got on that. Unclear. But I thought I'd throw that out there.
The victim identified as Marie Kelly. His final
yes.
victim is when he jumps into the 90s and sees that. And then after he has completed his wicked deed and is effectively, ostracized and committed by the Masons under a different name. Nothing more terrifying than being put into a 19th century asylum under a name that isn't yours as you lose your mind.
Yep.
pretty terrifying is when he kind of goes through all these other different eras. And I don't really know what to say on that or what it really adds to the story other than I think it's kind of a meditation on evil and how there is these kind of continuing evil in all these different eras, and they're all kind of the same spirit, even if they're, very unrelated in logical terms.
Right. Well, and you get the repeating of that point earlier in the book where they talk about, oh, well, there's this cycle, this cyclical nature of evil where like this bad thing happened in this year and then 70 years later and then 35 years later and then 10 years later. And so you get a repeat of that, but with these evil events that are happening. So Gaul is kind of, I saw it as a sort of reinforcement of the cyclicalness of evil. And like, do I think it was totally necessary? No. But I think that it was reinforcing that like the inevitability of evil. Just because Gaul was in prison doesn't mean that evil stops, which is really depressing.
Right. I think it ends up kind of being that's probably Alan Moore's actual purpose of writing this. Because the theory they're kind of extrapolating on here was one that was written by a separate author in the 1970s. And so they weren't like, oh, we're going to be the final truth tellers. They're putting in a new medium of a narrative comic book. But it's not framed as a mystery. It's not framed as a whodunit. It's very kind of like the actual events as they happen. It's clear what's happening throughout. Yes, there's weird kind of metaphysical things going on the side, but it's like, oh yeah, what's Goal. He's going to do this. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. It's a straight line for that. So I think the actual point of this book was just kind of like, why do we still obsess over who Jack the Ripper was in these murders? Maybe there's these cycles of evil, and it just kind of lingers, this evil spirit that encapsulates the terror and imagination of the people. That would probably be my guess of what his actual point of wanting to do this was, other than maybe just having his own personal interest in Jack the Ripper.
It is a sort of a conundrum of a book, of a story, because the beats. It's going to happen. And because you see the different perspectives, like, Inspector Aberline isn't on the right track, or when he starts to get on the right track, and the Masons are gonna keep him from learning the truth, and that, like, and what Gaul's gonna do and where he's going and which woman is going next, and it almost feels like there should have been, it's like a companion to something else, or like it wasn't. Not that it wasn't done, but that like it should have been part of a larger thing. I don't know. It just feels like it's sort of like, oh, well, okay, what now? Like, why did I just spend these hours reading this? Like the art is we can talk about the art in a minute. It's very striking and like the visual, but it just didn't feel like, I guess I was sort of like, what's the point of reading this?
Well, I think some of the points are, if we're going to switch into some of the other themes, I think one of the larger points of definitely the first half of the book is the role of power and class and royalty and those dynamics in both, yes, the society we're dealing with, 19th century England, but also as a whole, to the point where the fact that the situation they were in wound up with 5 women gruesomely murdered and a 6th one being forcibly committed to an asylum and her child ripped away from her. It's like, wow, that didn't need to happen at all. Because this, I don't need to say that, the idea of aristocracy is trash. We should all be able to agree on that. Whether or not you still like the fact that there's a queen in whatever of England, that's up to you. But if you're like, oh man, well, you couldn't possibly legally marry a commoner if you're royal blood, that's a weird thought to have. It's insane to me that, yes, your grandson, Queen Victoria, went and had a kid with a shop girl. That's a disgrace. Maybe try disowning him or doing something else before you're like, we should probably forcibly commit this woman to an asylum. She doesn't know what she did, but this is the best way to handle it. We're dealing it as a problem the poor person did rather than a problem that the rich person did is like that's just the tip of the iceberg of all this crazy crap right here.
Well, and I think that theme of the royalties fuck ups or the poor people's problem.
Oh, yes.
Like just the way that just the way that the sex workers are talked about
Mm-hmm.
and after they're murdered. Like not just they're talked about horribly, talked to horribly and talked about horribly when they're alive. But when they're murdered, they're just like they're treated like animals and just not even real people. And it's a lot of, had it coming, better to get another person, another woman, dirty woman off the street. Like it is very much blames the people in poverty that
Right.
It's even though it is a direct consequence of a royal's actions, right?
Yeah.
Like, and even though these women are murdered, it just is like, even if you don't know that there's a royal conspiracy going on, like the fact that multiple women from a poor neighborhood who all happen to be sex workers are getting murdered and like no one cares. They all basically blame the neighborhood and the women.
Yes. And really, so after, Annie gets committed, it's like, oh, she committed the sin of, being duped into loving a guy. The fact that the demands of these women is so minuscule that they're literally asking for 10 pounds, which, is more in 19th century money than it is nowadays, because it's what, like $17 nowadays, give or take. They ask for 10 pounds, 5 of which are so that they don't actively get murdered by a street gang who's trying to extort the local sex workers for just, existing. And that's why they're demanding this money. They're like, oh, how are we going to raise 5 pounds so that we don't get killed by this street gang? Marie Kelly, knowing this, scandal that happened, mind you, the fact that she wasn't trying to even capitalize on it beforehand is like, I know an easy way to stay alive. Let's try and get 10 pounds from this stupid artist guy I know, because he's trying to keep a secret. And that stupid artist guy, Syndicate, is the one who then totally narcs on it to the queen. He has to go up and be like, excuse me, mom, I've done something horrible, blah, 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 blah. It's just like, oh my god, it's such a small amount of money when it's like, yeah, the royal family probably should have just tried to give them 10 pounds, or 2 of these people were foreigners, send them back to their home country, send Marie Kelly back to Ireland, send Anna back to Sweden, do something with the other 2, send them up to Scotland or something. It's like, it's the 19th century, it's so easy to make somebody go away. There's no internet, there's no phones, it's so easy to make somebody go away without actually killing them. Or committing them to an asylum.
Well, and okay, so
it's bonkers to me that this is what they go to.
It is. Oh, it's 100%.
They deign to blackmail me for 10 pounds. I will kill them all.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely ridiculous. What I think is such an interesting tension is the character of Inspector Aberline. Inspector A.
Aberlin.
But we don't know his history in Whitechapel, but he obviously has one because he talks a lot about escaping from Whitechapel.
I think that's where he did like his beat cop days. So before he was a proper inspector and he was probably just, a copper.
That makes sense.
He was probably like walking the streets of Whitechapel and dealing with all the thugs and the street gangs and the sex workers there.
So he talks about like how he escaped from Whitechapel and he's pissed that he is now the lead on this case. It's in Whitechapel and this and then, like, he has to go investigate. And he also talks horribly about the women that are murdered and that are like just like the sex workers and he encounters in general in the neighborhood and like just terrible, horrible, anti-poor things, just like awful. And yet he unknowingly, right, befriends Mary Kelly and ends up like giving her the money, the 10 pounds. It just is because she doesn't tell him exactly why she needs it, but she's basically like,
is that Marie?
I thought it was Marie.
I thought it was a different woman because she always her name was Emma.
Yeah, I thought that was a fake name.
Why would she be giving a fake name? She never did any other time.
Oh, well, maybe she's not.
Yeah, no,
he
he just befriends another woman, another sex worker, while he's kind of investigating.
Okay, my point still stands.
I mean, I'm going to be double checking this right now because I was always just like, oh, he's just hanging out with another lady and he's just trying to get some information, but he ends up just like kind of half falling in love with her, just like having a crush on her.
Maybe. You should double check. I assumed Emma was a fake name, but now that you're saying why did she need a fake name, that makes sense.
Right.
Maybe it was just a woman named Emma. Either way, my point still stands because she basically... No, but I thought she was... Okay. My point might not stand if she's not Marie Kelly or Mary Kelly.
Okay. You know what I found?
Give it to
Eddie
me.
Campbell wrote a blog post about this exact problem.
I am so glad that he did this. What does he say?
All right. So, I guess this is in regards to a criticism he felt he faced where people are like, it's really hard to tell some of your characters apart and who's who. And this kind of is him explaining like, no, it's not my ability to not draw. It's based on some, I guess, trying to interpret the script he was given from Alan Moore.
Is it the idea that these women are all interchangeable? Because that's what I thought as I was reading.
So, Inspector Eberline, this is me quoting from this blog post. Inspector Eberline walks into the 10 Bells at the end of Chapter 6 and finds himself talking to a girl who calls herself Emma. Both Fred and Emma are constructing false lives for themselves in these scenes, and the reader is supposed to be feeling all the time that this is really Mary Kelly.
So I'm not crazy.
No, but we're not categorically stating it. How am I to draw something that remains in the fuzzy area of speculation? In the script, Alan asks for a lot of camera over shoulder and arm coming in from off panel, which, given that we would be dwelling on this setup for several scenes, struck me as frustrating because Eberline would be talking to a non-existent person since they have no true presence. In effect, given the feeling of a TV program where the interviewer is never visible, there would be no possibility or reactive body language, which is the essential spirit of my figure art.
Okay, so
it's intentionally unclear, and so we're both right and we're both wrong here.
Beautiful. Okay, then on my point, let me get back to my point about poverty, royalty, blaming.
Yes.
Okay. I think Eberline is an interesting figure that embodies this tension between the poor people are animals and aren't really human and everything is their fault, and poor people are people. So he befriends this woman who calls herself Emma.
And is probably Mary Kelly.
And he has a fake identity, right? Fred, he's a saddle maker, even though she's like, your hands are very soft for a saddle maker.
Yeah, he's like, let me go in this bar and try and get some info. So he's not going in pretending to be a cop. He's not saying he's a cop. He's,
right.
I'm just a regular guy.
Well, so long story short, he ends up having this friendship / potential romantic interest with Emma. And she reveals to him that she owes this debt of 10 pounds.
Yeah.
And he lends her the money. And she tries to be like, no, I can't take your money. And he's like, you're not taking it. You're just borrowing it. You'll pay it back whenever you can pay it back. And so it's just this, I think that moment in particular embodies this it's so interesting because when he's on the streets as a cop, is so anti-woman and anti-poor. But when he's talking with Emma, who you're assuming is Mary Kelly, who is a sex worker, when she asks for this money, he has this personal connection to her. And I think it reveals this like importance of the relationships, and that like how many poor people do you think Queen Victoria knows? Zero. Personally, zero. And I feel like that, but I feel like it reinforces that idea that like relationship alters perception, and it's this tension of like if Aberline is just thinking generally about sex workers in Whitechapel, he has very negative associations. But when he is talking to this one woman in particular and has this relationship with her, it's a totally different situation.
Right. Well, and I think Aberline really comes off as kind of like gruff and a little bit just ticked off and tired of his job. And the Emma character is the only person he kind of learns to open up with, because it starts as kind of a transactional relationship where he's trying to see if he can get some information. He ends up kind of developing like this little kind of like friendly crush with her, and he's very open about like, no, I don't want to, go to a room with you, or he's not looking to have sex with her, even though, she basically offers it for some money. He's just like, no, let me just buy you a beer and a chat, and she gets very uncomfortable about that because she's used to the more transactional relationship when she gets that attention from the whatever random men who approach her in these bars. So I think it's interesting that that is the only character where he's, kind of friendly with outside of the bookends of the story, the prologue and the epilogue, where he's an old man and he's on a walk with this clairvoyant, this, fake psychic clairvoyant guy, Lees, who was Queen Victoria's personal psychic and helps Aberline figure out that it's, it was Gull who did all this before it gets all re-swept under the rug.
Aberline isn't even, you don't see that relationship with his wife.
No, he's kind of a dick to his wife the whole time.
Who is also named Emma.
Oh.
Which is weird. Because at one point
I don't think I noticed that because she's only in a few scenes.
Well, at one point she's like, something along the lines... Basically, she implies that like their sex was really good last night, and she must have been pleasuring him so much because he yelled out her name, and then he looks really like embarrassed and chagrined
he meant the other Emma.
Because he meant the other Emma.
If you're gonna have an affair, I guess it's best to do it with somebody with the same name as your partner if you want to avoid having that weird name mix-up thing that happens in movies.
So it's interesting because he doesn't treat his wife he doesn't talk to his wife in the way he talks to Emma at all.
Yeah.
Which sort of shifting into women in this story.
Yes, I think it's time to pivot to that.
There's a lot. Like, I feel like we could talk about this forever. We won't. But I think that Aberline's relationship with women is so interesting and is sort of a standalone in relationship to how royalty and the public in general treat women. So Aberline, has this very negative association with the just general sex workers in Whitechapel. He's very sort of distant with his wife. He doesn't really engage with her. He has this one woman, this Emma character, who he does get to open up with and has sort of this true friendship with. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I would say that the depiction of women in this story, anytime a male character is we're looking at the perspective of a male character, or a male character is in the scene, it is incredibly negative. And Queen Victoria, even though she's a woman, has no qualms about the shit that they do to Annie and to the sex workers, and she just doesn't even care. And that combination of poverty and being female is like this double sword straight to the gut.
It's true. Of the few middle to upper class women that you see in here, none of them are ever mistreated in any way, outside of Aberline being kind of a dick to his wife, and that he's being cold and reserved, but he's not being actively.
He's not abusive.
No, he's being kind of neglectful, but nothing crazy. And it's just the only women who actually have anything bad happen to them are these poor women, these lower class women. Even the non-sex worker ones, when you kind of see the women who come in as witnesses at different points for their interviews. They always kind of have something crappy happening to them or are treated as being kind of mad or drawn much more kind of like disfiguringly, because I think they're trying to represent how they were being viewed by Aberline or whoever was, interacting with them at that point. It's just kind of, yeah, no, it's a terrible system for, poor people in general and especially poor women.
And it's interesting, we talked about Gaul and his belief about male dominance, but that is a theme that's not just reserved to the Freemasons and Gaul. It's part of that of society as a whole, with the exception of like the highest royalty, like the Queen and stuff. But it just is, if you think about the way that even the men in Whitechapel, whether it's a boyfriend, whether it's a shop owner or the innkeeper, the way they talk to the women is so degrading. I have in my mind, it sticks with me. I think he's an innkeeper. He like runs a boarding house or an inn where.
What, the Dossing house?
Yeah. Yes. The Dossing house.
Yeah. So it's basically a place where you can rent a bed for a night. And so it's used by several of the sex workers who don't have a permanent room or residence where they can stay. So they have to make their, quid for the evening and pay it off to have somewhere to sleep.
Right, and he is just, there's one character, I can't remember which one, but she comes in and she is drunk and she has drunk her Dossing house fee or whatever. And he has no empathy, no sympathy, no qualms. He's like, nope, get out until you have your money. Like, you do not come back until you have the money to stay here. And she's like, well, can I get it? Like, basically, like, I have some of it, but I don't have all of it.
Can I owe you the rest tomorrow?
Can I owe you the rest? And he's like, nope. If you don't have it, you're out. And like, he just is so horrible. And then even Mary Kelly's boyfriend, who initially is pretty kind and like seems loving, but then it went, well, okay, and to be fair, she did bring another woman into the bed, and they were, I
would say he's like the one poor man who kind of like proves to be mostly decent.
Yes.
Yeah. In this particular story.
Yes.
But going back to what you were saying.
But yes, he is mostly decent for sure until she's wronged him, which, like, I get it. She basically cheated on him. So
she's kind of, well, she the way it's setting up. So Mary Kelly has now seen 3 of her friends who she kind of made this pact with all get mysteriously murdered by somebody, and she's like
eviscerated murder, not just like
the most
boinked
terrifying
on the head.
Yeah, she's like, I'm probably gonna get killed at some point. So she's in this kind of crazed state about it, and she's just like drinking herself into a stupor over it, which is understandably causing some strain with her, live-in boyfriend guy, Joe.
Joe, yeah.
And then she starts bringing in a couple different women at different points and being like, hey, let's all have sex together. And Joe's kind of like, Mary, you're just drunk all the time. I want to talk about this issue. And then you keep bringing these extra ladies around, and I'm not really feeling it. And then they do kind of have like a fight, but all he really does is smash a window.
Well, he does. He smashes a window, but then he says, and I get, like, maybe it was the heat of the fight, and maybe I was especially sensitive to it.
What does he say?
Well, he calls her horrible names, like, I just think that this is part, that the treatment of these women, it was part of the struggle for me with this story.
Yeah.
The visual graphic violence is a doozy. In particular, the final murder is just so truly graphic, and goes on for a really long time. And I can understand why. I do understand why. But it was really hard. I found myself just sort of skipping panels, reading the words and not looking at it very closely because it was just a lot. But that...
I'm saying from here, let's pivot straight into like the illustration and specifically the way Eddie Campbell's depicting the violence here.
So I think overall, to me, Eddie Campbell's style is perfect for this story.
It's very fitting. I gotta agree with that one.
It's so sketchy, but at times it's sketchy, but it's also can be really sharp.
Uh-huh.
And he does a great job of drawing your eye. It's all black and white, but he does a great job of drawing your eye to different parts depending on what he wants you to focus on, what's important.
Right. And I'm not sure if it's primarily direction or his illustration. I do like that it alternates depending on the importance of the scene. If there's background, a detailed background, no background, that's kind of like their camera focus is, instead of, blurring the background and say, a film shot, he is actively like, nope, the only two things in this picture are these two people talking. It doesn't matter where they are anymore. It's just them talking. And that's kind of his version of a zoom in this case. And I think it's really effective because it's so sketchy, and sometimes it looks like, oh, maybe they just were rushed and he forgot to draw. It's like, no, he actively chose not to draw that, or to just draw this part, or for things to look a little bit more blurred or a little bit more just twisted than they normally do. It's all very distinctive, even though sometimes it looks a little haphazard.
Yeah, the haphazardness fits every time. Gives you, and I think it gives you that feeling of tension and that feeling of sort of dread and impending doom, depending on what is going on, what is coming, or what has just happened.
Moving on with the art, the paneling of the book is mostly straightforward. I'm trying to think of any particular moments where there was distinctive ways that the actual panels were broken down. There wasn't. Sometimes there are comics out there that have very distinctive panel shapes or big splash pages of different things. There's almost none of that. It's pretty straightforward, where it's either 3 panels across, or sometimes you'll get kind of one long panel across, but it doesn't fill the whole page. It's just a 1x3 length panel. It's a pretty straightforward system in that regard.
Yeah, there are a few bits where it's either like a panel that takes up the entire length of the page, but not the entire width, or it takes up 2/3 of the page instead of 1/3. But for the most part, it is pretty uniform, which I kind of appreciated. We both read it on a Kindle, and so it, for me, flowed easily, which I was a little worried about, because I have seen some of those comics that the panels are sort of funky, it's up and down and not quite left to right. And
those comics translate very poorly, in my opinion, to reading digitally. So, I think our general statement is like, oh, if you can get the physical book, that's great. This is one comic where I'm like, oh, I think it actually benefited a decent amount from being able to read it in a digital format. One, because I think a lot of the print formats out there now are the colorized version.
Yes.
Which, some people might have different opinions on, since it wasn't the original way it was published, but maybe it makes certain things a little bit more clear. Certainly it might make it a little bit more clear which woman's which at certain points. But, we were able to read it in its original black and white and be able to really zoom in and get some of the details from that more precise view on it, if we're just talking about, viewing the actual artwork of this book.
I think the color version would be hard in the violence. So let's talk about the his depiction of the murders.
Okay, this is the part we've kicked this down to the end.
We have waited as long as we possibly could have waited to talk about this, and we're not going to spend very much time on it for our sanity. Truly.
Yeah, there were a few points I started to feel like physically ill.
What I will say, here's my statement on the depiction of violence in this book.
Yeah.
It is inherent in this story.
Mm-hmm.
The evisceration of the women is important to understanding how truly horrific and gruesome these murders were. For the most part, there were limited panels with the violence, with the especially graphic violence. The last murder went on for far too long, in my personal opinion. I felt incredibly uncomfortable. But it was
also like the climax, where you're like, okay, I see why they're making this one longer, but it's also the most gruesome of them all. I think in real life too, it was like the goriest.
He cuts
Ugh.
off her breast.
Ugh.
He like, I mean, all the,
Sorry,
yeah, no,
I was picturing it again. I was just like, ugh.
like I said, I think it was far too long, and I understand why that choice was made. I
Yeah.
do, but I found it so hard. Those panels I found so hard to get through. All of them I found challenging, but that one in particular. And then I think that is a big warning. If you might read From Hell, if you think you're interested, if you haven't read it already, I think this is the one that there is no spoiler. You really need to know how graphic the violence is when it's depicted in this story.
I would say, unless you have no idea what Jack the Ripper or the Whitechapel murders, anything about that is, I think it's difficult to spoil this book. Because they kind of like the weird elements of it, they kind of set up right from the get-go. And there's no surprise to it. It's just kind of like, do you want to experience a retelling of this particular theory with some meditations on time and things of that nature? I don't think it's a book you can know everything that happens, and it's different than reading it. Like, you have to actually go through and see this all happening and kind of the impending nature of it. I think part of that is just knowing, that, I guess it's technically up in the air if Mary Kelly survives, or maybe it's a different woman that gets murdered. Which ties in, the fact that I totally whiffed on that and the Emma thing, I think kind of go hand in hand. If you get one, it kind of leads to the other. But if you miss the Emma thing, it's kind of like, oh, no, she's dead.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but it's like, oh, maybe she took that 10 pounds and ran back to Ireland, because that's probably enough to cross. I doubt it was, any more than that. So, yeah, no, it's one of those books where it's like, if you can stomach it and sound interested at all from this, I recommend reading it. It's an experience. I don't know if I'm going to go back to this. Certainly not for my own personal enjoyment, but it's something that I'm glad I went through, because honestly, I knew very little about the Jack the Ripper murders other than he killed sex workers for one, couple months in England. Honestly, I think people always assume he killed a lot more people.
Yeah, I think that, and so I also think that that assumption comes from the brutality of the murders. I think that because these murders were so horrible, there was an assumption that more people died. But no, it was 5 women.
Right.
Because in the book, at least, Gull has mistaken identity. We don't know, of course, in real life what actually happened. But 5 women did die.
Yes.
Then that was it. All horribly, brutally. But only 5. Ugh.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts for now before we go on to our next thing and then do the pairing with us next week?
None. I'm done.
I'm sure there's more to talk about, but we'll come back around to it. Moving on to our arguably much lighter subject for this particular pairing, let's talk a little bit about Assassin's Creed Syndicate, the 2015 Ubisoft Assassin's Creed game set in the 19th century in London. This is a Assassin's Creed game, meaning it is a historical action role-playing-ish game. It's mostly action. There's a very small amount of role-playing. And in this particular game, you play Jacob and Evie Fry, who are 2 twins raised in the, assassin organization, and their goal is to reclaim London. Over the course of the game, you help reclaim London from the secret society of the Templars, get, control for liberty and freedom back into the hands of the people. And then in the DLC we'll be talking about as well, the Jack the Ripper, the DLC, which is set 20 years later during the Whitechapel murders. You play specifically as Evie Fry, who returns from India to investigate the Jack the Ripper murders and the disappearance of her brother Jacob. Aaron, you have played primarily just the DLC. I've played primarily just the base game through completion, and then also watched a playthrough of the DLC. So tell me a little bit about what your initial impressions of this game are. Just your gut go with this game.
I liked this game way more than I thought I was going to.
Yeah.
If I didn't need to play some other games for some upcoming pairings, I would probably go back. I watched you play some of the main game, but I didn't personally play any of it. But I really loved playing the DLC. I thought the controls were pretty easy, except for the few times I killed people instead of putting them to sleep, but that's okay. I hit circle instead of square instead of circle, or something like that. Whatever.
You're just trying to choke them out, but instead you stab them. It's pretty common in the Assassin's Creed games.
Anyway, but overall, I thought gameplay was really nice. Visually, it's beautiful. Like,
yeah,
I love the height that is in this game. So in the DLC, it's surprise set in Whitechapel primarily. With you can go to a couple other places, but
it's not the full map.
It's not the full map. It's really just the Whitechapel area. But the height of the buildings, there's different, there's street level, of course, but then there are, train tracks, and there are buildings that go tall, and then there are shorter buildings, and there are, mansions and squat houses and bridges and church steeples. And so I thought that's something I really enjoy. I mean, this game is a lot of running around. Mm-hmm. And so it was a nice environment to run around in. Mm-hmm. I have some qualms about the story of Jack the Ripper in this DLC.
Like I said, this is the lighter half.
But in that there was very little story in the DLC. And what story there was a little unclear. But overall, I really liked it.
Okay. I think going off a few of the points you made there, I think this game has a lot of individual asset beauty. And there are certain scenes where you're like, wow, that is a beautiful 3D depiction of, Parliament, or, I'm forgetting the names of all the places in London, but I don't know the names of quite all of them. All the various plazas, the big famous-y buildings that I don't know as well, because having never been to London or studied much about it. But it's a game that I artistically, I feel it's a little drab at times. I don't know if that's just because it's industrial 19th century London, and that's just kind of inherently a little gross. And so maybe they're just trying to be realistic.
I do think that the mutedness of the environment set the tone for the story.
Okay.
For me, I don't know if it's because I was playing the specific DLC, which is very streamlined. Like, yeah, there's side quests you can do, but the main story is just the one main story.
Right.
And like, there are limited side quests and things. But it gives you that feeling of sort of the city must go on, but there is this sort of dread hanging over parts of it. You sort of get this tension of like, oh, well, who's going to die next? What's going to happen next? Mm-hmm. And it is the muted tones give you, I think, this dampening of spirits, which for me really fit well with my gameplay experience.
Right. Maybe I think in the base game where it's a longer game, it's, I think I had 30 plus hours in it, whereas the Jack the Ripper, I think you had about 10.
Yeah, that's a way. I could see how the muted tones would be old.
Yeah, I think, well, because, the map is only so big, understandably. It's still a huge map. But it's all set in the city of London, so they can't be like, here's the desert area and here's the tropical beach area, like some more fantastical games can do, because they are trying to make it feel like you're actually in this real life place. I maybe it was just some certain points with lighting and things, but it just got a little draining, and there were certain points where I couldn't tell if I was on a rooftop in one neighborhood or another neighborhood.
Oh, that's frustrating.
And so it just gets kind of repetitive. You're like, oh, I'm in a constant hallway of rooftops that all look vaguely the same, that all feel vaguely the same outside of these kind of like large, individual monument kind of places where you're like, oh, that's a one-of-a-kind building because that is that, big, important building.
I do think that I had the benefit. I think that the benefit of playing only the DLC is that I didn't get that. I didn't feel bored or tired or frustrated with the setting. Mm-hmm. But I think that is the risk of real historical cities, right? Like when you're set, and even when you're set in that city, which like it was cool. I enjoyed it, but I only played 10 hours and there were a couple, interludes where you're elsewhere. But I think that, unlike the more fantastical, I think like there's an Assassin's Creed pirate one you've played.
Yeah, which is all set in the Caribbean.
Right.
And so it's fun and tropical islandy.
And I imagine, you can have a little more of the sort of mystically, like, shit that's going on. It fits a little bit better. Mm-hmm. I think you said Renaissance Italy is one.
That's Assassin's Creed 2.
Which again has a little bit more of a mystical, fantastical feeling.
It's definitely a bit more romantic looking.
Where I think that industrial London, there's nothing fantastical or mystical or magical about that setting.
But you get a train that you get to turn into your hideout / base.
Well, not in the DLC.
No, I know, but in the main game, that's like your base is constantly circling London, which is cool until you're like, man, this is inconvenient.
Right, but I do think that is the risk of this type of environment.
Right.
Is just like, there's just not... It's not inherently as interesting as some of the other settings.
All that being said, I think that the setting and the map and the attention to detail in a lot of aspects of building this world is one of the best things that this game has going for it, in that it does feel like a specific time and place. Yes, a fictionalized one. Yes, a somewhat fantastical one where you can just hop around on rooftops and people don't really give a shit. But it is still, it feels much more like a place, and that's one of the reasons I thought this would be an interesting one to pair with this, just because it is lighter on the story, but very heavy on time and place. Like Assassin's Creed loves its settings, and that's basically what the theming is. They're like, yeah, the story's there, whatever, but like, this is the Paris, this is the London, this is the Caribbean, this is the, the Renaissance Italy. Like, they really want to make you feel like you're in the place where they have their setting. And I think they generally succeed. I never questioned whether or not I was in London. I just sometimes questioned which part of London I was in.
Fair.
Moving on to some of the more story elements, there's really not a ton of story elements in the base game.
There's
you basically
not
come to town and but honestly there's more. There's more of a driving plot. In the first one, it's literally like, hey, we were raised to be assassins by our dad who is also an assassin. Let's go to London because it's the biggest city that's under Templar control and, obviously the seat of the British Empire, and that's a big deal. Let's try and liberate it. That's basically where it starts off. It's just like these two, 20-ish something twins who are just like, yeah, time to go take back London.
So there's not even like an incident that's a catalyst, like someone's
not a specific one,
like assassin's not murdered, or like control is not taken, and that's the impetus for the story.
Not in the 19th century, and this is something we'll get into in the pairing discussion a little bit more. So the Assassin's Creed games technically take place in the modern, nowadays times, and everything that you're doing in the game, you're doing in this specialized computer simulation. I love the eyes you're making. I mean, I didn't write this.
Okay, I know podcasting, not a visual medium.
You're in the Animus computer, in which you are able to go into the life experiences of your ancestors.
This is
so
dumb.
Somebody from the modern assassins who's related to Jacob and Evie Fry is able to go in a special machine and relive their lives as if it was, like a specialized computer simulation, like the video game we were playing. So
I have a lot of feelings.
And the goal of the modern assassin people is they're trying to get information on basically a magical relic from blah 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 BS. That's the actual story, and then that story takes them to like, oh, let's explore what Jacob and Evie Fry did when they were in London. And what they did was they killed a lot of Templars. They killed a lot of other people, mostly Templars and a few police officers, and they saved the Queen from an evil Templar guy named Steric, who had taken over all the industries, all the gangs, and basically everything. And they win. That's the whole story. There's not much else that happens.
Yay.
So look, go into Jack the Ripper a little bit. Because as lax of a story as it is still way more concise in an actual story.
Okay, so Jack the Ripper starts with... obviously it's based on the real historical Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper, 1888.
Yes.
So Evie Fry Jacob is investigating these murders and then gets kidnapped by presumably Jack the Ripper. He disappears. There's suspicion he might be Jack the Ripper. Blah, 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 blah. So Evie comes back from India. Jacob had summoned her. She then takes lead on this investigation to figure out what's going on, works with Inspector Aberline to investigate the murders. And we learn that Jack the Ripper is a rogue assassin that was trained by Jacob and blames Jacob for his mother's murder, except his mother wasn't actually murdered. She
committed to an asylum?
She was
and
committed
then
to
died in it because we've already discussed asylums were bad.
Correct. So like he considers it a murder. Jack considers it a murder. Everyone else is like, I'm just a crazy lady who died in an asylum. And so that it's basically this big ploy for Jack to get back at Jacob and Evie because he blames them and
them and the assassins
guild
at large.
or whatever.
He's going to destroy the assassins by, I guess, just causing havoc in assassin-controlled London.
Correct. He's basically trying to blame, like he's trying to get people to think that like Jacob is Jack the Ripper.
Right.
That's one of the things that, that's part of the reason he disappears Jacob is because he wants them to think like, oh, that Jacob is Jack the Ripper, and then if they know he's an assassin, blah, 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 they'll blame the assassins. Assassins will crumble. All the women he kills, all the sex workers he kills are assassins.
Woo!
Which is awesome, but also real weird. Like, that was a out of left field sort of revelation.
Well,
like,
here's
okay.
Here's the real trick with the Assassin's Creed games. Anybody of import needs to either be affiliated with the Templars or the Assassins. So if you're the victim of a high-profile murder, you're either a Templar or an assassin.
Got it.
If you're a historical figure, you're either aligned with, if not part of, the Templars or the Assassins. So they'll be like, Queen of England. Well, apparently she's cool with the Assassins, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. She should totally be a frickin' Templar. But whatever. These random prostitutes. Also, assassins.
Yeah, so in that, I mean, the story concludes
Jack the Ripper, also an assassin, but a bad one.
But a bad one. So the story concludes where he goes back to the asylum, Bedlam Asylum? I don't know.
The big asylum where his mother died.
Right. Wherever,
it doesn't matter where. They don't care that much.
Wherever his mother died. And Evie obviously follows him there. There's a confrontation. She murders Jack the Ripper. We never see his face. He wears this weird pillowcase situation.
Yeah, no, I thought it was weird that they really played it up like a horror Halloween-y thing where it's like he looks kind of like a Scarecrow from Batman kind of guy. He's wearing a big top hat but like a burlap sack mask, or it's just like interesting choice there considering you got to run around and climb on stuff, and he wields an enormous knife that he just brutally stabs people with, which as we learned from Hell is not exactly how Jack the Ripper probably did it. They were pretty meticulous.
Right. So Jack the Ripper's dead. Evie finds Jacob. And then that's just the end.
That's literally the end.
And this is my qualm with the story. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty simplistic story, which is fine. However, the ending is so lame. Like, really, here are my thoughts. Either Jack the Ripper should have been a Templar, would have made a lot more sense, or Jack the Ripper should have not have actually died and escaped and like is still out there, or like there's some other, I don't know. There was just like,
but the murders ended it. Jack the Ripper has to be
my
done.
God. But it was just like, oh, Jack the Ripper. And then it's like Jack the Ripper is this assassin who knows the Fries and like trained with them and then went rogue. And now he's just dead. And it was like, it felt like so much buildup for such a lame ending. And I'm not happy about it.
Yeah, I think one thing the Assassin's games can sometimes have issues with is creating those boss fight scenarios. Because I know the final fight of the game, the main game, was a little similar in that it's like there's one guy, he's kind of at the end of a room, he's kind of shooting obstacles at you, and then you basically have to go up and like beat him up and do the right parries at the right time like 4 times over. But that's not really something you do regularly in the actual game. The game is very mission focused, and your mission is, oh, assassinate this one guy with whatever tools you have. Oh, kidnap this person. Kill all the guys guarding this house or whatever. It's rarely take out this one big bad who's stronger than a normal human. So when they suddenly have that at the end, it's kind of like this doesn't really feel like the rest of the game, and not in a good way.
Yeah, for the Jack the Ripper DLC, the last battle was so frustrating. There were other missions I had failed and had to like restart, but it felt, the boss fight felt like we were in a totally different situation. It was real unclear what you were supposed to do. I ended up having to watch a playthrough to figure out what to do, because it was like you had to sneak on him, but you're in this open area, but there are some places you can hide. If you hang down, you cannot be detected. Like, it made me do things that I hadn't had to do at all, and it was very frustrating. I yelled a lot.
You did. So that's our critique of the narrative, and that the Assassin's Creed narrative is not as strong as I guess we would like it to be. Moving on to more like the actual missions, because you talked about how you enjoyed the gameplay, and I enjoyed playing the game as well, where it's like, I did it for 30 hours. Yeah, to do it for this podcast, sure, but also I didn't have to do all the side quests I did to just complete the story. But I enjoyed doing them. So what sort of mission types were you really working with, and what did you dislike about them in this game? Because basically what you end up with is a big map full of different types of missions you can do. So what were some of your favorites or least favorites in that respect?
I hate carriage driving. Carriage driving is stupid. I don't like those missions. They were dumb. Is
it because you have to be mean to the horses?
No, you have to be slow.
Oh yeah, you have the stealth horse missions in the DLC.
I didn't like the stealth horse missions. That was annoying. But I will say I did do at least one of every kind of mission, because I felt like I should at least try it. I have to say, my very favorite of the missions was when you go into the brothels and you sort of rescue the sex workers. Like, you go in, so Nellie is the sex worker that I guess you and Evie and Jacob know from other experiences in London. You don't really know why you know her, but you know her. And she is sort of a leader among Whitechapel sex workers. And so you go to these different brothels, these different houses that there are lots of sex workers and men in. I assume there are always brothels, but and you go and you basically have to sneak through usually a 3-level structure and take out the men and release the women, like let the women run away. And I think that was my favorite type of mission, because I found myself really enjoying the stealthy assassin aspect of it. I liked sneaking around and throwing knives and like dropping bodies from up high, or from actually down the stairs and through the guardrail and like that kind of thing. And so that was something I really enjoyed. I wanted more of those. there was the one that sort of fell in the middle for me, where there was a series of missions with Inspector Aberline where you have, or not Inspector Aberline, I'm sorry. There's a series of missions with the newspaper guy who's receiving letters. And basically, he's got all these fake letters, and you have to go like track down the writer.
And they're all pretending to be Jack the Ripper.
And so you like, they're always in Templar territory. Or, well, I don't know that it's explicitly Templar.
Controlled by gangs.
They don't actually say it's the Templars.
I think they kind of imply, based on the little bit that I saw, that Jack had kind of taken over your former gang.
That's right.
So in the main game, one of the big things you do is you build up this gang called the Rooks, and it helps you reclaim territory.
Yes.
It gives you like minions you can use to do different things with. And so I think the implication is that Jack has kind of supplanted Jacob.
That's right. So Rook, now that I'm having this light bulb, boop. You Rook territory. So the Rook gang. But the letter writers are always in a Rook controlled area. You have to identify them and you have to tail them. And you have to be sneaky, which I enjoy. And you have to assassinate like sneakily, which I enjoy. But you also couldn't kill your target. You had to scare them. And that is an element of gameplay we haven't touched on in the DLC that I did not like.
And it only exists in the DLC.
And it's fear tactics. And basically, you have these a couple non-lethal fear tactics. You have one lethal fear tactic where you spike a dude, like you spike people.
Yeah, you like stick them down to the ground with like a big staple-looking thing.
Yeah, so like I think technically it's non-lethal, but like it's basically lethal. Yeah. But you have these scare tactics, so you can like do a scream. You can throw fear bombs. You can have these darts that are like hallucinogenic fear darts, but it's not just like, oh, you're feared or you're scared. You have like, there's different levels. So some enemies couldn't be afraid, and other enemies, if they were at like a not scared level, there was a neutral level and then a scared level. So you would have to, throw 2 bombs, or like you had to do 2 different fear tactics. And that was really challenging for me because there were some situations where you had to scare a target and not kill a target. And when you've got 7 other characters coming to kill you, but one guy needs to be scared, like it's just really hard to not hit them in the fray, which I killed a lot of people I wasn't supposed to kill that way. Because it's just like, when you start punching people, I don't know. You just punch them.
It's real easy to kind of get stuck in the fray. And do you mind if I go on a tangent right
No, go for it.
I think that's one of my general issues with the concept of Assassin's Creed conceptually versus how it always ends up kind of going. Because Assassin's Creed kind of implies like you're doing stealth missions almost exclusively. You're taking out precise targets in sneaky ways. And while you can do that, the game and many of the missions specifically require you to take out large groups of enemies, sometimes sneakily, sometimes you can just go in guns blazing, though. And while I understand that that's kind of a way of playing the game, a way of, and they want to make that an option for the players to decide how they want to do it, it's kind of funny where it's like, oh yeah, I'm a stealthy assassin, but I also just can murder all these dudes and be like, oh, look at me, I'm so smart and sneaky, ha ha ha, just go in and stab them all. And that's one thing I can never quite square with how I'm quote unquote supposed to play versus how you can play. And it's like, man, I don't know. It's sometimes hard to square away because when you think about like how they depict Jack the Ripper, because they make you play as Jack the Ripper too,
which is awful.
Yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of when games will make you play as the bad guys.
Well, and you don't even play. Sorry, you don't even play as the bad guy for very long, which is the other issue. Like you can't even get in a rhythm with him because you only play him for a few little segments.
And I think the few segments in which they do it, it honestly would have been better if they just made like a 30-second cinematic.
Correct.
I don't know if that was somehow harder to do or more expensive or what, or if they're just like, oh, no, people want to play as Jack the Ripper. Of course they do. But the way they depict him is just like a monstrous guy who will go around and like stab and impale and all that, and it's just like, oh, that's really not his MO. That's not what, the actual Jack the Ripper did. It's like, no, honestly, they probably should have played him up as being a more gruesome but stealthy killer than the average assassin, because the average assassin, like Evie and Jacob, are not as stealthy as you'd like them to be. So if Jack was very meticulously doing these terrible things to these specific targets, I think that would have been more in line with creating a sense of fear and intimidation from that character for us, the player, while also being honestly more accurate to his actual crimes.
Well, and I think that the burlap, the cartoonishness of the burlap bag with the top hat, like, this guy isn't blending into society in any world.
Oh, yeah.
And so I do think it would have been much more interesting if he was a super sneaky assassin, gruesome assassin.
And once he gets you, you're screwed, because he's going to flay your skin off.
Right, exactly. And like, they still could have done something to obscure his face if that was important, but like, we don't know what he looks like. We never find out what he looks like. So seeing his face wouldn't have revealed that he knew Jacob and Evie. Like, it's not like that was going to be this critical moment of, oh my gosh. Like, it just doesn't exist.
Yeah,
there.
I guess they must have just done the mask primarily just to give you like the maybe twist of what if it still is Jacob? What if it still is somebody? But since it turns out being nobody, it's like having a mystery identity doesn't mean much when it ends up just being like, oh, they were nobody. It was just that guy, Jack.
Right.
Which is what it was. So it's like, well, and then there was no point to the mystery, because it just left me guessing, and then, oh, surprise, it was nobody. Woo!
Well, and you knew from the beginning it couldn't be Jacob, because you confront Jack the Ripper as Jacob.
I thought that there was a slight chance that it could have been some weird hallucination. Stuff like that happen. Well, and there is a hallucination that Evie goes through in the game.
Yes.
Where she thinks she's fighting multiple Jack the Rippers, and ends up being just like random dudes.
That is true.
So, if they were trying to do something real freaky with like a who am I type scenario. Also, the fact that you control Jack the Ripper, maybe it's like, oh, it's like when you were controlling Jacob. I'm just saying these would have been better twists.
Fair. Yes, no, absolutely. These would have been far better twists.
All the love to the people at Ubisoft. You get paid more money than me, so I don't care if you think this critique is unfair. I thought that story was complete crap.
Cosigned.
The missions going way back to missions.
Yeah,
there were so many tangents away. The missions of the main game.
What are your thoughts about those missions?
Yeah, I thought individually they're pretty fun. They get repetitive after a while, but each one on their own, if you're only doing like 2 of each, they're all pretty fun.
I have to say that, as echoed in Jack the Ripper, even though there are obviously fewer missions, there are like 4 types you can go do.
Yeah.
I did maybe 2 or 3 of each, except for the dumb stealthy carriage. So I'm not glad to hear that it's the same in the main game, but it does translate that same way.
So you mentioned specifically like the brothel liberation, quote unquote. The version that they have of that in the main game is the child labor liberation, which is one in which I'm like, morally, yes, no, we definitely need to liberate child factories, and they're much more likely to be held against their will. And, whatever people's thoughts are on sex work, to say that all brothels were operated under a system of
it wasn't
literal kidnapping, or how did they frame it?
No. It wasn't that the brothel itself was kidnapping the women. It was that the rooks were
took over a brothel?
taking them over and being really violent. So it actually was. Sorry, I did not set that up.
So they're
correctly.
like, this is a cool brothel, or a normal brothel.
This is a place where sex workers are either live or work.
Yes,
and
at least semi-willingly.
Yeah, and
then different levels.
And these men are violent and taking over and taking advantage of these sex workers.
Gotcha. Okay, well that makes more sense and is probably in a better perspective of how to view, relationships of, sex work vis-a-vis liberation. Anyway, child labor, you basically go into a factory, and technically you can do them without killing anybody, but it's needlessly difficult, like everything in this game. If you don't want to murder anybody.
Correct.
Your main goal... Oh, no, I think you have to murder people. I think you always have to murder the foreman, and then you have to go to each one of these little groups and say, hey, you're free now, children, run away, which doesn't make a lot of sense because the adults would presumably stop them, but then it never happens, even if they're still alive. So that's a pretty fun one because it's basically just a big clear out mission. If you don't think about the morality of murdering 20 people for just being an accessory to child labor, it's like, oh, sweet. Okay, pop, got you. Haha. That's moderately fun to play. There's the kidnapping missions. Was there kidnapping missions in the DLC?
I had a couple where you escort. Is it like where you kidnap someone and then you escort them away somewhere?
Yeah, you have to you're like holding on to them and you have to like kind of sneakily get them to a carriage and then run away with them.
There were quite a few in the main storyline.
Really?
Not actually very many side. If I'm remembering correctly, I don't know that there were any side missions that were kidnapping like that.
Geez.
But in the main storyline, I had 2 or 3 that I had to like walk with them through crowds, and you have to maintain your little circle so that you don't get
don't get noticed.
That was hard. Those were hard.
Those were mostly side missions in the main game, and they were my least favorite. Like I could do some of them, but sometimes the layout would be such a thing that you'd mess up. You'd be like, okay, let me peace out and come back later, and then it would glitch, and they would just notice you instantly.
That's frustrating.
Which is more of a game structure issue than an actual mission issue. But those are my least favorite. I think one of my favorites was generally the fight clubs, which is just, you fight 6 waves of guys in literally like a bare knuckle boxing ring. And it was, basically how long can you dodge, parry, and counter effectively, and then you get a bunch of money when you complete it. So I thought those were kind of fun arcadey games to play on the side, and much more what I was looking for as like a side game.
What's funny is they had Fight Club side missions in Jack the Ripper, but it falls in the Inspector Apperline quest, and so you're like shutting down the fight clubs. So you go and you fight waves of dudes, and then at the end you fight the like proprietor of the fight club, like whoever's running it, and so you shut it down.
That is hilarious because if you say it's a continuity from one game to the other, I primarily played as Eevee when I did the fight clubs and stuff. So I ended up in that storyline, Eevee, 20 years prior, made a shit ton of money just fighting all these dudes illegally. And then 20, years after that is just like, oh, we're all done here. No more.
You can grow up, I suppose, and have changes of heart. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's kind of an interesting change of heart of all things to be like, oh, we really need to shut down the bare knuckle boxing.
Nah.
I think those were there was a couple other ones, and then there was stuff like raiding the boats would be fun, so you could always like hijack carriages, and a lot of this had to do with kind of the gang warfare. And I generally enjoyed the hijacking of carriages from different people, and then you bring it back to your base, and you have to kind of get away in a high-speed horse chase. How many horses did you end up killing? Because I killed probably hundreds.
That makes me sad. I killed 0. I'm better than you.
Well, it's because they'd be like, oh, you are in this horse chase. You have to destroy this carriage. And one of the ways you can do that, honestly, is shooting the horses or ramming the carriage and then the horse kind of flies off. So it's part of the game. But if you really care about not harming horses, play another game. It's not super graphic. It's less graphic than how you murder people.
Play the DLC and you don't have to murder a single horse.
They probably don't want you to murder the horses. It's just something that happens a lot.
Sad.
But yeah, no, these games, I would recommend them if you're looking for an Assassin's Creed open world game and you want to hang out in 19th century London.
It certainly is a low stake. For me, it was low stakes, which I can get anxious about games. But for this one, I think because of the nature of it, it was sort of that open worldy, and the missions weren't very long, so you weren't going on this long drawn out, at least in the DLC, this long drawn out mission. I was able to pick it up and play 20 minutes of it and then put it down and not feel pissed off because I couldn't do it. Like, I think that it gave a good sort of no barrier entry. Like I said, the controls were pretty simple. And so it was just like a fun beat 'em up. I was not there for the story. I was for this, but I wasn't really.
Yeah.
And I liked the environment. I thought running around in London was really fun. And so will I go back to Assassin's Creed Syndicate? No. Will I try another Assassin's Creed game in a different setting? Maybe.
Oh, man, we got to find a pirate book. Do Assassin's Creed Black Flag.
That's all we have for this discussion episode for the Twins from Hell. Next week, we will do our big pairing, talk about the game and the book in relationship to each other, and all of our Jack the Ripper thoughts.
You can find all of our posts, episodes, and everything at gameandread.wordpress.com. You can also find me on social media on Twitter at NerdInTheWorld.
I am on Twitter at BookishTextPat and on Instagram at A Tale of Two Shelves.
Our intro music is written and performed by Avery Murchison. You can find a link to his Bandcamp in our episode description.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
Game and Read.